Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 24, and we are going to talk about the poor and poverty. Usually when I begin the class that discusses the poor, I ask the students to describe the poor for everybody else in the class, right? And people are generally reluctant to share the stereotypical understanding of what is poor, but eventually we get around to poor people have poor hygiene, bad hygiene. They smell bad, they don't bathe well, they don't brush their teeth, they have poor education. Obviously, they're not very educated. That's why they're poor. They don't know how to get out of poverty. They're unemployed, obviously, not enough education, poor hygiene, they can't get a job. Their clothes are ratty and smelly. And that's generally the safe answers that you can say these days in a class when it comes to describing the poor. And then I asked them, so where were these poor people living that you were imagining? Do they live in America? Do they live in Africa? Do they live in another country? What color are these people? And these questions kind of, surprise a lot of the students because they kind of assumed a certain kind of racialization, right? So we're talking about poor people. Obviously, you're talking about blank, right? I want to read to you a paragraph that Walter Williams put in his article, The Underclass. It's originally written by Anthony Daniels, and so I'm just going to quote it. Dalrymple says that he cannot recall meeting a 16-year-old from the public housing project near his hospital who could perform simple multiplication operations such as 9 times 7. One 17-year-old told him, "We didn't get that far." This was after 12 years of attending school. One of Dalrymple's patients took a drug overdose because of constant bullying from classmates. She was stupid because she was clever. What her peers meant by that was anyone who worked hard and performed well at school was wasting his time when truancy and wandering downtown were deemed preferable. The underlying threat was, if you don't mend your ways and join us, we'll beat you up. Right? That's the end of the excerpt. And then I would look up at the class and ask them, what color are these students? And they all have this bewildered look because the assumption is that they're all black, right? Because in the United States, in many of the large urban centers here in the United States, the poor people, the ghettos, the poor neighborhoods are largely populated by African Americans. And so a shocking number of, if not all of them, were imagining the projects here in the United States. But Dalrymple, or, the author, was writing in England, and the ghettos over there are filled with white kids, right? And so the same type of phenomena that you'll see in the inner city here in the United States also can be found in England, except they are not black, which sort of, undermines this impression that poverty is racism, right? It's the result of racism. Because if it really was racism, then if you go to England, why are white people poor? So maybe it's not about your skin color, but perhaps it's about something else, right? And so this is something kind of we need to keep in mind, that we have already prior knowledge in our perception, in our conceptualization of what is poor. And since we imagine the poor in a certain way, we're imagining specific people perhaps that we even know. We're going to propose solutions based on our prior knowledge. Is that in the box or out of the box thinking, right? I mean, if we're just going to go by stereotypical generalizations or racializations, as we saw from episode 8, right? Building a racial understanding of people, the poor, then that's not really helpful. Okay. So the poor, as I just said, is a racialization. It's a generalization of a diverse group of people based on a characteristic. They're poor, right? And we went over race making in episode 8. So if you missed that one, You can go back and check that out and understand why I'm talking about the poor like it's a race, because it is, right? All right. So there are poor people, but you got to understand, not only do you find poor people all over the world, and they are not all Black, but people become poor in many, many different ways. Some people become poor because of gambling. Some people become poor because of bad businesses, failed business, a downturn in the economy. They lost their job. Sometimes you have bad government practices, which ruins the country, and all of a sudden everyone is poor, right? Like pre-World War II Germany, you have all that hyperinflation. So poor are all over the world. It seems to be a recurring phenomena, and some people will even say that the um, default situation, default existence of humanity is poverty, right? And I think I'll talk about. Ooh, I should write a note to myself. Talk about Say's law. All right, so so it's not who's poor or what should we do about poor people, but how can we get people not to be poor? And why do some people remain poor? You know, after talking about this, I'll comment and I'll say, do you realize that most college students, right, unless you come from a very wealthy family or you already have, excuse me, that doesn't count. If you already have a full-time job, you have a career, and now you're a non-traditional student, you come back to college just to get the degree, or you're going to night school, or you're taking classes during the day and you work at night, but you're really wealthy, unless you're one of those people, you're in the bottom 20%. In other words, most college students are in the bottom 20%. And none of them were describing themselves when I asked them to describe poor people, right? Unless they have poor hygiene and bad clothes, you know what I'm saying? So there's that kind of situation. None of them are thinking about themselves. And none of them are thinking that after 10 years, I'm still going to be poor, unless, of course, they're theater students. And I've had a bunch of them. And when I asked the question, how many of you are expecting me still poor after 10 years, they all raised their hands. It was hilarious. But anyway, so some people, yes, some people do choose poverty, and they know it, but they know that that's the life, right? So they're rolling the dice, trying to get that shot at seeing that one of those few people who get that marquee career kind of thing. Then anyway. So you have all of these different ways that people can become poor, but society has just one solution for all of those different situations, and that is give them money, right? It doesn't matter if you're poor people in a different country, the United States just sends money to your government, which they all take for themselves and do very little for the poor people in that country. But hey, there are ways around it. Maybe we'll talk about it in another episode. But poor people in America, what do? You give people, you try to give them money. That's it. But obviously, giving money to a gambling addict or a drug addict is not really going to help their situation, so they say. Plus, where does all that money come from? Well, it comes from taxation, right? So you have to take it from some people to give it to other people, and not even really knowing if that's what they actually need. Eventually, too, because, you know, once there's money available, people then, and we'll talk about the welfare trap in a moment, but people will then readjust their affairs to qualify to receive that money, because why not? It's free money, as some people would say. And so more and more people need help from those welfare programs. And so eventually now you have inflation, right? Because now you can't keep raising taxes. And so what you do is you tax the people secretly through inflation. You steal from people by printing too much money, so that the value of the dollars, at least in America, the value of the dollars that we use go down in value. So you need more dollars to be able to buy the same things, right? So some people will say that inflation is just simply rising prices, but that's not inflation. Rising prices are a consequence of inflation, which is the government printing too much money, right? Inflation hurts the poor and fixed income people, which if they weren't poor before, and now they're poor, right? So inflation is the result of the government trying to help so-called poor people, but then it hurts poor people, right? So this cannot be the solution that we are looking for. One thing to remember is something that used to be prevalent here in the United States, and that's social mobility. We talked a little bit about social mobility in one of the Marx episodes, how Marx really disliked social mobility. But in 2007, 2007, there was a survey between 1996 and 2005 that 50%, half of everyone who's in the bottom 20% are no longer in the bottom 20% after 10 years, right? They get out of the bottom 20%. And of the top 0.1%, only 25% of those people are still in the top 0.1%, right? In other words, this is a lot of social mobility. And we'd have a lot more if we had less government, but we'll talk about that later. So taxes also are taken more from the working poor, right? And the working poor generally don't have access to the programs that this tax money is being used for, right? So people who are below the poverty line, they qualify for welfare. Who pays for that? Well, the working poor still have to pay for that, but they make too much to qualify for any of that welfare. Also, it is known in the United States that a lot of the working poor do not go to college, but a lot of the tax money is used for state schools and even private schools as well. And so what you see is the working poor basically sustaining a lot of the other people in society. This leads to a lot of tax avoidance, black market activity. Some of the more wealthier people, they will move to another country, renounce their citizenship. We talked about this before. But the wealthier people, they can afford to pay people, accountants and lawyers, to help them avoid paying taxes. The poor don't have that option. They don't have the money and the resources to be able to legally avoid paying taxes. And so they have to revert to crime. And this is why generally you'll see higher crime rates, generally prosecuted, in the news, in the statistics, crime rates among the poor, right? And then you'll see that it's as a result, ultimately, of the government trying to help poor people, right? Which is just kind of insane logic. So the only real true thing that we can say about poor people is that, well, they're poor. That's the only true thing that you can say. You can't say that they're all black. You can't say that they're all white. Can't say that they're all, brown or yellow or whatever. You can't say that they're all poor for the same reason. You can't say that they're all poor forever. But yet the government and a lot of people in power, a lot of people in teaching positions always talk about them as if they are monolithic, as if they're all the same. These days, poverty is determined by income, right? So how much do you make a year per household, right? Everyone living in the house, you add up all of their income, and that's the income, right? Welfare, right? So the government giving money to people who live below the poverty line, right? It actually incentivizes more poverty, right? Because people who make just above the poverty line, well, their quality of life is not that much better than someone who's just below the poverty line, but they don't qualify for any of the benefits. Here's an example. So in 2012, a family of four, if they made $23,492 about, they qualify for welfare. But if you made just $500 more, right? So $24,500 means you don't qualify for welfare, but the quality of your life is not really that much different than someone who is making $23,492. Another example, in New York City, this was also around 2013, 2012. If you were a single mother with two kids, you would get $38,000 in benefits, right? So you get all these benefits. So imagine if your benefits are like $40,000, but you made $500 too much. You lose all your benefits, and the trade-off is not that much, because even if you made $500 more, you're probably paying a lot of that in taxes, right? Another way of looking at this, if you look at the bottom 20% of society, you give all of the people in the bottom 20% $1 million, let's just say, which, I think they've done already, but you give them $1 million, right? Well, you don't get rid of poverty, because just the next group of people, the next, fifth of 20% is now the bottom 20%. Also, because so many people find different ways, they're so creative in becoming poor, that eventually a lot of people are going to lose all their money and find themselves in the original bottom 20% all over again. But here's the kicker. Okay, so yeah. Okay. But here's the thing. The United States has a national debt that's like $33 trillion. But see, a lot of people don't understand that this is just the running budget. This does not include unfunded liabilities like Medicare, Social Security. If you add all of that together, depending on who you ask, it's over $200 trillion. This is all because government is trying to help poor people. In the effort to try to help poor people, we are all of us, poor, right? The value of the dollar is evaporating. That's why so many countries are trying to start alternate payment systems like the BRICS Bank, BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And all these other countries are trying to join that alternate payment system, because they see that the dollar is losing value and that the United States will never pay back its debts, right? And we'll talk about dollar privilege in another episode. So basically, all of us are poor. How bad is it? Well, in 1970, the average middle class income was $9,500. In America, 1970, $9,500. If you were paid, this was before the United States went off the gold standard. If you were paid in gold, that was about 225 ounces in gold, right? Today, well, 2020, the average salary was $48,500 per year. And it's about 26 ounces of gold. So you went from earning 225 ounces of gold in 1970. Now you earn 26 ounces. In other words, that's how much the government has stolen from the value of the currency. And so the question is, who's poor? Well, basically, that would be the vast majority of people. A lot of people don't realize it yet, but they are poor. They're on the hook for this national debt. And when the world figures out that the United States is never going to pay back its debts, they've already defaulted at least 3 times, and that the dollar is worthless. Once people figure that out, once the world figures that out, then we're going to feel the pain, the consequences of all of these bad policies all at once. And it's going to be ugly. Or everything I just said was very subjective, and none of this will happen, and life will be just so awesome. But I can tell that most of you, if you're listening to this, then you realize that there is something seriously wrong in our society. But that's poverty. We're all poor. And depending on how you're going to determine poverty, by income level, well, then it changes. But again, at the end of the day, it's just simply a racialization. If you want to resolve poverty, you have to understand that each person is poor, probably for a different reason. That's it for this episode. I will see you in the next one.